The Trouble with Being Born, translated from the French by Richard Howard. 1. 3 in the morning. I realize this second, then this one, then the next. I draw up the balance sheet for each minute. And why all this? Because I was born. It is a special type of sleeplessness that produces the indictment of birth. Ever since I was born, that since has a resonance so dreadful to my ears it becomes unendurable. There is a kind of knowledge that strips whatever you do of weight and scope. For such knowledge, everything is without basis except itself. Pure to the point of abhorring even the notion of an object, it translates that extreme science according to which doing, or not doing, something comes down to the same thing, and is accompanied by an equally extreme satisfaction. That of being able to rehearse each time, the discovery that any gesture performed is not worth defending, that nothing is enhanced by the merest vestige of substance, that reality falls within the province of lunacy. Such knowledge deserves to be called posthumous. It functions as if the knower were alive and not alive, a being and the memory of a being. It's already in the past, he says about all he achieves, even as he achieves it, thereby forever destitute of the present. We do not rush toward death. We flee the catastrophe of birth, survivors struggling to forget it. Fear of death is merely the projection into the future of a fear which dates back to our first moment of life. We are reluctant, of course, to treat birth as a scourge. Has it not been inculcated as the sovereign good? Have we not been told that the worst came at the end, not at the outset of our lives? Yet evil, the real evil, is behind, not ahead of us. What escaped Jesus did not escape Buddha. If 3 things did not exist in the world, O disciples, the perfect one would not appear in the world. And ahead of old age and death, he places the fact of birth, source of every infirmity, every disaster. We can endure any truth, however destructive, provided it replaces everything, provided it affords as much vitality as the hope for which it substitutes. I do nothing, granted, but I see the hours pass, which is better than trying to fill them. No need to elaborate works. Merely say something that can be murmured in the ear of a drunkard or a dying man. Nothing is a better proof of how far humanity has regressed than the impossibility of finding a single nation, a single tribe, among whom birth still provokes mourning and lamentations. To defy heredity is to defy billions of years, to defy the first cell. There is a God at the outset, if not at the end, of every joy. Never comfortable in the immediate, I am lured only by what precedes me, what distances me from here, the numberless moments when I was not, the non-born. Physical need of dishonor. How I should have liked to be the executioner's son. What right have you to pray for me? I need no intercessor. I shall manage alone. The prayers of a wretch I might accept, but no one else's, not even a saint's. I cannot bear your bothering about my salvation. If I apprehend salvation and flee it, your prayers are merely an indiscretion. Invest them elsewhere. In any case, we do not serve the same gods. If mine are impotent, there is every reason to believe yours are no less so. Even assuming they are as you imagine them, they would still lack the power to cure me of a horror older than my memory. What misery a sensation is, ecstasy itself, perhaps, is nothing more. unmaking, decreating, is the only task man may take upon himself if he aspires, as everything suggests, to distinguish himself from the Creator. I know that my birth is fortuitous, a laughable accident, and yet, as soon as I forget myself, I behave as if it were a capital event, indispensable to the progress and equilibrium of the world. To have committed every crime but that of being a father. As a general rule, men expect disappointment. They know they must not be impatient, that it will come sooner or later, that it will hold off long enough for them to proceed with their undertakings of the moment. The disabused man is different. For him, disappointment occurs at the same time as the deed. He has no need to await it. It is present. By freeing himself from succession, he has devoured the possible and rendered the future superfluous. I cannot meet you in your future, he says to the others. We do not have a single moment in common, because for him the whole of the future is already here. When we perceive the end in the beginning, we move faster than time. Illumination, that lightning disappointment, affords a certitude which transforms disillusion into deliverance. I disentangle myself from appearances, yet I am snarled in them nonetheless, or rather, I am halfway between these appearances and that which invalidates them, that which has neither name nor content, that which is nothing and everything. I shall never take the decisive step outside them. My nature forces me to drift, to remain forever in the equivocal, and if I were to attempt a clean break in one direction or the other, I should perish by my salvation. My faculty for disappointment surpasses understanding. It is what lets me comprehend Buddha, but also what keeps me from following him. What we can no longer commiserate with counts for nothing, no longer exists. We realize why our past so quickly stops being ours and turns into history, something which no longer concerns anyone. In the deepest part of yourself, aspire to be as dispossessed, as lamentable as God. True contact between beings is established only by mute presence, by apparent non-communication, by that mysterious and wordless exchange which resembles inward prayer. What I know at 60, I knew as well at 20. 40 years of a superfluous labor of verification. I am for the most part so convinced that everything is lacking in basis, consequence, justification, that if someone dared to contradict me, even the man I most admire, he would seem to me a charlatan or a fool. Even in childhood I watched the hours flow, independent of any reference, any action, any event, the disjunction of time from what was not itself, its autonomous existence, its special status, its empire, its tyranny. I remember quite clearly that afternoon when, for the first time, confronting the empty universe, I was no more than a passage of moments reluctant to go on playing their proper parts. Time was coming unstuck from being at my expense. Unlike Job, I have not cursed the day I was born. All the other days, on the contrary, I have covered with my anathemas. If death had only negative aspects, dying would be an unmanageable action. Everything exists, nothing exists. Either formula affords a like serenity. The man of anxiety to his misfortune remains between them, trembling and perplexed, forever at the mercy of a nuance, incapable of gaining a foothold in the security of being or in the absence of being. Here on the coast of Normandy, at this hour of the morning, I needed no one. The very gulls' presence bothered me. I drove them off with stones. And hearing their supernatural shrieks, I realized that that was just what I wanted, that only the sinister could soothe me, and that it was for such a confrontation that I had got up before dawn. In this our life, to be in life. Suddenly I am struck by the strangeness of such an expression, as if it applied to no one. Whenever I flag and feel sorry for my brain, I am carried away by an irresistible desire to proclaim. That is the moment I realize the paltry depths out of which rise reformers, prophets, and saviors. I long to be free, desperately free, free as the stillborn are free. If there is so much discomfort and ambiguity in lucidity, it is because lucidity is the result of the poor use to which we have put our sleepless nights. Our obsession with birth, by shifting us to a point before our past, robs us of our pleasure in the future, in the present, and even in the past. Rare are the days when, projected into post-history, I fail to witness the gods' hilarity at leaving behind the human episode. What we need is an alternate vision when that of the Last Judgment no longer satisfies anyone. An idea, a being, anything which becomes incarnate loses identity, turns grotesque. Frustration of all achievement. Never quit the possible, wallow in eternal trifling. Forget to be born. The real, the unique misfortune to see the light of day. A disaster which dates back to aggressiveness, to the seed of expansion and rage within origins, to the tendency to the worst which first shook them up. When we see someone again after many years, we should sit down facing each other and say nothing for hours, so that by means of silence our consternation can relish itself. Days of miraculous sterility. Instead of rejoicing over them, proclaiming victory, transforming this drought into a celebration, seeing it as an illustration of my fulfillment, my maturity, in short, my detachment, I let myself be invaded by spite and resentment. So tenacious is the old Adam in us, the bustling canaille, unfit for self-effacement. I am enraptured by Hindu philosophy, whose essential endeavor is to surmount the self, and everything I do, everything I think, is only myself and the self's humiliations. While we are performing an action, we have a goal. Performed, the action has no more reality for us than the goal we were seeking. Nothing of much consequence here, no more than a game. But some of us are conscious of this game in the course of the action. We experience the conclusion in the premises, the achieved in the virtual. We undermine seriousness by the very fact that we exist. The vision of non-reality, of universal default, is the product of an everyday sensation and a sudden frisson. Everything is a game. Without such a revelation, the sensation we haul through our usual lives would not have that characteristic stamp our metaphysical experiences require to be distinguished from their imitations, our discomforts. For every discomfort is only an abortive metaphysical experience. When we have worn out the interest we once took in death, when we realize we have nothing more to gain from it, we fall back on birth. We turn to a much more inexhaustible abyss. At this very moment, I am suffering. As we say in French, j'ai mal. This event, crucial for me, is non-existent, even inconceivable for anyone else, for everyone else. Except for God, if that word can have a meaning. We hear on all sides, that if everything is pointless, to do well whatever it is you're doing is not. Yet it is, even so. To reach this conclusion, and to endure it, you need ply no trade, or, at most, a king's, say Solomon's. I react like everyone else, even like those I most despise, but I make up for it by deploring every action I commit, good or bad. Where are my sensations? They have melted into me. And what is this me, this self, but the sum of these evaporated sensations? Extraordinary and null. These two adjectives apply to the sexual act, and consequently to everything resulting from it, to life first of all. Lucidity is the only vice which makes us free, free in a desert. As the years pass, the number of those we can communicate with diminishes. When there is no longer anyone to talk to, at last we will be as we were before stooping to a name. Once we reject lyricism, to blacken a page becomes an ordeal. What's the use of writing in order to say exactly what we had to say? We cannot consent to be judged by someone who has suffered less than ourselves, and since each of us regards himself as an unrecognized Job, I dream of an ideal confessor to tell everything to, spill it all. I dream of a blasé saint. After all the ages of dying, the living must have learned the trick. How else explain how the insect, the rodent, and man himself have managed, after a little fuss, to do it so properly? Paradise was unendurable. Otherwise the first man would have adapted to it. This world is no less so, since here we regret paradise or anticipate another one. What to do, where to go, do nothing and go nowhere. Easy enough. Health is certainly a good thing, but those who possess it have been denied the opportunity of realizing it, for self-conscious health is either compromised or about to be. Since no one delights in his absence of infirmities, we may speak without exaggeration of a just punishment of the healthy. Some have misfortunes, others obsessions. Which are worse off? Don't be fair to me. I can do without everything but the tonic of injustice. All is suffering. Modernized, the Buddhist expression runs, all is nightmare. Thereby, nirvana, whose mission now is to end a much more widespread torment, is no longer a recourse reserved to the few, but becomes as universal as nightmare itself. What is that one crucifixion compared to the daily kind any insomniac endures? I was walking late one night along a tree-lined path. A chestnut fell at my feet. The noise it made as it burst, the resonance it provoked in me, and an upheaval out of all proportion to this insignificant event thrust me into miracle, into the rapture of the definitive, as if there were no more questions, only answers. I was drunk on 1,000 unexpected discoveries, none of which I could make use of. This is how I nearly reached the supreme, but instead I went on with my walk. We tell our troubles to someone only to make him suffer, to make him assume them for himself. If we wanted to win him over, we would admit none but abstract worries, the only kind those who love us are eager to hear. I do not forgive myself for being born. It is as if, creeping into this world, I had profaned a mystery, betrayed some momentous pledge, committed a fault of nameless gravity. Yet in a less assured mood, birth seems a calamity. I would be miserable not having known. Thought is never innocent, for it is pitiless, it is aggressive, it helps us burst our bonds. Were we to suppress what is evil and even demonic in thought, we should have to renounce the very concept of deliverance. The surest way of not being deceived is to undermine one certainty after the next. Yet the fact remains that everything that matters was accomplished outside doubt. For a long time, always in fact, I have known that life here on earth is not what I needed, and that I wasn't able to deal with it. For this reason, and for this reason alone, I have acquired a touch of spiritual pride, so that my existence seems to me the degradation and the erosion of a psalm. Our thoughts, in the pay of our panic, are oriented toward the future, follow the trail of all fear, open out onto death. And we invert their course. We send them backward when we direct them toward birth, and force them to linger upon it. Thereby they lose even that vigor, that unappeasable tension which underlies the horror of death, and which is useful to our thoughts, if they would grow, develop, gather force. Hence we see why, by taking a contrary trajectory, they lack spirit, and are so weary. When at last they come up against their initial frontier, that they no longer have the energy to look beyond, toward the never born. It is not my beginnings, it is the beginning that matters to me. If I bump into my birth, into a minor obsession, it is because I cannot grapple with the first moment of time. Every individual discomfort leads back, ultimately, to a cosmogonic discomfort, each of our sensations expiating that crime of the primordial sensation by which being crept out of somewhere. Though we may prefer ourselves to the universe, we nonetheless loathe ourselves much more than we suspect. If the wise man is so rare a phenomenon, it is because he seems unshaken by the aversion which, like all beings, he must feel for himself. No difference between being and non-being, if we apprehend them with the same intensity. Nescience is the basis of everything. It creates everything by an action repeated every moment. It produces this and any world, since it continually takes for real what in fact is not. Nescience is the tremendous mistake that serves as the basis of all our truths. It is older and more powerful than all the gods combined. This is how we recognize the man who has tendencies toward an inner quest. He will set failure above any success. He will even seek it out, unconsciously, of course. This is because failure, always essential, reveals us to ourselves, permits us to see ourselves as God sees us, whereas success distances us from what is most inward in ourselves, and indeed in everything. There was a time when time did not yet exist. The rejection of birth is nothing but the nostalgia for this time before time. I think of so many friends who are no more, and I pity them. Yet they are not so much to be pitied, for they have solved every problem, beginning with the problem of death. In the fact of being born, there is such an absence of necessity that when you think about it a little more than usual, you are left, ignorant how to react, with a foolish grin. Two kinds of mind, daylight and nocturnal. They have neither the same method nor the same morality. In broad daylight, you watch yourself. In the dark, you speak out. The salutary or awkward consequences of what he thinks matter little to the man who questions himself at hours when others are the prey of sleep. Hence he meditates upon the bad luck of being born without concern for the harm he can cause others or himself. After midnight begins the intoxication of pernicious truths. As the years accumulate, we form an increasingly somber image of the future. Is this only to console ourselves for being excluded from it? Yes, in appearance. No, in fact. For the future has always been hideous, man being able to remedy his evils only by aggravating them, so that in each epoch existence is much more tolerable before the solution is found to the difficulties of the moment. In major perplexities, try to live as if history were done with, and to react like a monster riddled by serenity. If I used to ask myself, over a coffin, what good did it do the occupant to be born, I now put the same question about anyone alive. The emphasis on birth is no more than the craving for the insoluble carried to the point of insanity. Regarding death, I ceaselessly waver between mystery and inconsequentiality, between the pyramids and the morgue. It is impossible to feel that there was a time when we did not exist, hence our attachment to the personage we were before being born. Meditate but 1 hour upon the self's non-existence, and you will feel yourself to be another man, said a priest of the Japanese Kusha sect to a Western visitor. Without having frequented the Buddhist monasteries, how many times have I not lingered over the world's unreality, and hence my own? I have not become another man for that, no, but there certainly has remained with me the feeling that my identity is entirely illusory, and that by losing it I have lost nothing, except something, except everything. Instead of clinging to the fact of being born, as good sense bids, I take the risk, I turn back, I retrogress increasingly toward some unknown beginning. I move from origin to origin. Someday, perhaps, I shall manage to reach origin itself in order to rest there or be wrecked. X insults me. I am about to hit him. Thinking it over, I refrain. Who am I? Which is my real self, the self of the retort or that of the refraining? My first reaction is always energetic, the second one flabby. What is known as wisdom is ultimately only a perpetual thinking it over, i.e., non-action as first impulse. If attachment is an evil, we must look for its cause in the scandal of birth, for to be born is to be attached. Detachment, then, should apply itself to getting rid of the traces of this scandal, the most serious and intolerable of all. Amid anxiety and distress, sudden calm at the thought of the fetus one has been. At this precise moment, no reproach proceeding from men or gods can affect me. I have as good a conscience as if I had never existed. It is a mistake to believe in a direct relation between suffering reverses and being dead set against birth. Such opposition has deeper, more distant roots, and would occur even if one had only the shadow of a grievance against existence. In fact, it is never more virulent than in cases of extreme good fortune. Thracians and Bogomils. I cannot forget that I have haunted the same whereabouts as they, nor that the former wept over the newborn, and the latter, in order to justify God, held Satan responsible for the infamy of creation. During the long nights in the caves, how many hamlets must have murmured their endless monologues? For it is likely that the apogee of metaphysical torment is to be located well before that universal insipidity which followed the advent of philosophy. The obsession with birth proceeds from an exacerbation of memory, from an omnipresence of the past, as well as from a craving for the impasse, for the first impasse. No openness, hence no joy from the past, but solely from the present, and from a future emancipated from time. For years, in fact for life, to have meditated only on your last moments, only to discover, when at last you approached them, that it was of no use, that the thought of death helps in everything, save in dying. It is our discomforts which provoke, which create consciousness. Their task accomplished, they weaken and disappear one after the other. Consciousness, however, remains and survives them, without recalling what it owes to them, without even ever having known. Hence it continually proclaims its autonomy, its sovereignty, even when it loathes itself and would do away with itself. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, if a monk became proud of, or merely satisfied with, the task he was performing, he was to forsake it then and there. One danger not dreaded by the man who has lived in the thirst for unsatisfaction, in an orgy of remorse and disgust. If it is true that God dislikes taking sides, I should feel no awkwardness in his presence. So pleased would I be to imitate him, to be like him in everything, without opinion. To get up in the morning, wash, and then wait for some unforeseen variety of dread or depression. I would give the whole universe and all of Shakespeare for a grain of ataraxy. Nietzsche's great luck to have ended as he did, in euphoria. Endlessly to refer to a world where nothing yet stooped to occurrence, where you anticipated consciousness without desiring it, where, wallowing in the virtual, you rejoiced in the null plenitude of a self anterior to selfhood. Not to have been born, merely musing on that. What happiness, what freedom, what space. 2. If disgust for the world conferred sanctity of itself, I fail to see how I could avoid canonization. No one has lived so close to his skeleton as I have lived to mine, from which results an endless dialogue and certain truths which I manage neither to accept nor to reject. It is easier to get on with vices than with virtues. The vices, accommodating by nature, help each other, are full of mutual indulgence, whereas the jealous virtues combat and annihilate each other, showing in everything their incompatibility and their intolerance. It is trifling to believe in what you do or in what others do. You should avoid simulacra and even realities. You should take up a position external to everything and every one, drive off or grind down your appetites, live, according to a Hindu adage, with as few desires as a solitary elephant. I forgive X everything because of his obsolete smile. He who hates himself is not humble. In certain men, everything, absolutely everything, derives from physiology. Their body is their mind is their body. Time, fertile in resources, more inventive and more charitable than we think, possesses a remarkable capacity to help us out, to afford us at any hour of the day some new humiliation. I have always sought out landscapes that preceded God, whence my weakness for chaos. I have decided not to oppose anyone ever again, since I have noticed that I always end by resembling my latest enemy. For a long while I have lived with the notion that I was the most normal being that ever existed. This notion gave me the taste, even the passion, for being unproductive. What was the use of being prized in a world inhabited by madmen, a world mired in mania and stupidity? For whom was one to bother, and to what end? It remains to be seen if I have quite freed myself from the certitude, salvation in the absolute, ruin in the immediate. Violent men are generally sickly, broken down. They live in perpetual combustion at the expense of their bodies, exactly like ascetics, who in the discipline of quietude erode and exhaust themselves quite as much as the furious. Write books only if you are going to say in them the things you would never dare confide to anyone. When Mara, the tempter, tries to supplant the Buddha, the latter says, among other things, "By what right do you claim to rule over men and over the universe? Have you suffered for knowledge?" This is the crucial, perhaps the sole question we should ask ourselves when we scrutinize anything, especially a thinker. There is never too great a distinction made between those who have paid for the tiniest step toward knowledge and those, incomparably more numerous, who have received a convenient, indifferent knowledge, a knowledge without ordeals. We say he has no talent, only tone, but tone is precisely what cannot be invented. We're born with it. Tone is an inherited grace, the privilege some of us have of making our organic pulsations felt. Tone is more than talent, it is its essence. The same feeling of not belonging, of futility, wherever I go. I pretend interest in what matters nothing to me. I bestir myself mechanically or out of charity, without ever being caught up, without ever being somewhere. What attracts me is elsewhere, and I don't know what that elsewhere is. The farther men get from God, the farther they advance into the knowledge of religions. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened. No sooner are they open than the drama begins. To look without understanding, that is paradise. Hell, then, would be the place where we understand too much. I get along quite well with someone only when he is at his lowest point and has neither the desire nor the strength to restore his habitual illusions. Pitilessly judging our contemporaries, we have every likelihood of figuring, in the eyes of posterity, as penetrating minds. At one stroke we renounce the risky aspect of admiration, the marvelous perils it supposes. For admiration is a risk, the most unforeseeable of all, because it may happen to turn out well. Ideas come as you walk, Nietzsche said. Walking dissipates thoughts, Shankara taught. Both these are equally well-founded, hence equally true, as each of us can discover for himself in the space of an hour, sometimes of a minute. No variety of literary originality is still possible unless we torture, unless we pulverize language. It proceeds differently if we abide by the expression of the idea as such. Here we find ourselves in an area where requirements have not altered since the pre-Socratics. If only we could reach back before the concept, could write on a level with the senses, record the infinitesimal variations of what we touch, do what a reptile would do if it were to set about writing. Anything good we can have comes from our indolence, from our incapability of taking action, executing our projects and plans. It is the impossibility or the refusal of self-realization which sustains our virtues, and it is the will to do our utmost that carries us to excesses, to disorders. That glorious delirium Saint Teresa of Avila speaks of, invoking one of the phases of her union with God, is what a desiccated mind, necessarily jealous, will never forgive the mystics. Not one moment when I have not been conscious of being outside paradise. Only what you hide is profound, is true, whence the power of base feelings. Ama nesciri, says the Imitation of Christ, love to be unknown. We are happy with ourselves and with the world only when we conform to this precept. The intrinsic value of a book does not depend on the importance of its subject, else the theologians would prevail, and mightily, but on the manner of approaching the accidental and the insignificant, of mastering the infinitesimal. the essential has never acquired the least talent. The feeling of being 10,000 years behind or ahead of the others, of belonging to the beginnings or to the end of humanity. Negation never proceeds from reasoning, but from something much more obscure and old. Arguments come afterward to justify and sustain it. Every no rises out of the blood. With the help of the erosion of memory, to recall the first initiatives of matter and the risk of life which followed from them. Each time I fail to think about death, I have the impression of cheating, of deceiving someone in me. There are nights that the most ingenious torturers could not have invented. We emerge from them in pieces, stupid, dazed, with neither memories nor anticipations, and without even knowing who we are. And it is then that the day seems useless, light pernicious, even more oppressive than the darkness. A conscious fruit fly would have to confront exactly the same difficulties, the same kind of insoluble problems as man. Better to be an animal than a man, an insect than an animal, a plant than an insect, and so on. Salvation, whatever diminishes the kingdom of consciousness and compromises its supremacy. I have all the defects of other people, and yet everything they do seems to me inconceivable. Considering things according to nature, man was made to live facing outward. If he would see into himself, he must close his eyes, renounce his endeavors, quit the immediate. What is called inner life is a belated phenomenon, possible only by a slowing down of our vital activities, the soul being able to emerge and elaborate itself only at the expense of the good behavior of our organs. The merest atmospheric variation jeopardizes my plans, not to speak of my convictions. This kind of dependency, the most humiliating kind, unfailingly lays me low, even as it dissipates what few illusions remain as to my possibilities of being free, and as to freedom itself. What is the use of swaggering if you are at the mercy of wet and dry? One craves a less lamentable bondage, and gods of another kidney. It is not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late. When you know quite absolutely that everything is unreal, you then cannot see why you should take the trouble to prove it. As it leaves dawn behind and advances into the day, light prostitutes itself and is redeemed, ethics of twilight. Only at the moment it vanishes. In Buddhist writings, mention is often made of the abyss of birth, an abyss indeed, a gulf into which we do not fall, but from which, instead, we emerge, to our universal chagrin. At increasingly wider intervals, impulses of gratitude toward Job and Chamfort, toward vociferation and vitriol. Each opinion, each view is necessarily partial, truncated, inadequate. In philosophy, and in anything, originality comes down to incomplete definitions. If we consider closely our so-called generous actions, there is none which, from some aspect, is not blameworthy and even harmful, so that we come to regret having performed it, so that we must choose, finally, between abstention and remorse. Explosive force of any mortification. Every vanquished desire affords us power. We have the more hold over this world, the further we withdraw from it, the less we adhere to it. Renunciation confers an infinite power. My disappointments Instead of converging toward a center and constituting, if not a system, at least an ensemble, are scattered, each supposing itself unique and thereby wasted, lacking organization. The only successful philosophies and religions are the ones that flatter us, whether in the name of progress or of hell. Damned or not, man experiences an absolute need to be at the heart of everything. It is, in fact, solely for this reason that he is man, that he has become man, and if some day he no longer feels this need, he must give way to some other animal prouder, madder than himself. He detested objective truths, the burden of argument, sustained reasoning. He disliked demonstrating. He wanted to convince no one. Others are a dialectician's invention. The more injured you are by time, the more you seek to escape it. To write a faultless page, or only a sentence, raises you above becoming and its corruptions. You transcend death by the pursuit of the indestructible in speech, in the very symbol of nullity. At the climax of a failure, at the moment when shame is about to do us in, suddenly we are swept away by a frenzy of pride which lasts only long enough to drain us, to leave us without energy, to lower, with our powers, the intensity of our shame. If death is as horrible as is claimed, how is it that after the passage of a certain period of time we consider happy any being, friend or enemy, who has ceased to live? More than once I have managed to leave my room, for if I had stayed there I could not be sure of being able to resist some sudden resolution. The street is more reassuring. You think less about yourself there. There everything weakens and wilts, beginning with your own confusion. Characteristic of sickness to stay awake when everything sleeps, when everything is at rest, even the sick man. When we are young, we take a certain pleasure in our infirmities. They seem so new, so rich. With age, they no longer surprise us. We know them too well. Now, without anything unexpected in them, they do not deserve to be endured. Once we appeal to our most intimate selves, once we begin to labor and to produce, we lay claim to gifts, we become unconscious of our own gaps. No one is in a position to admit that what comes out of his own depths might be worthless. Self-knowledge, a contradiction in terms. All these poems, where it is merely the poem that is in question, a whole poetry with no other substance than itself. What would we say of a prayer whose object was religion? The mind that puts everything in question reaches, after 1,000 interrogations, an almost total inertia, a situation which the inert, in fact, knows from the start by instinct. For what is inertia but a congenital perplexity? What a disappointment that Epicurus, the sage I most needed, should have written over 300 treatises. And what a relief that they are lost. What do you do from morning to night? I endure myself. A remark of my brother's apropos of the troubles and pains our mother endured. Old age is nature's self-criticism. One must be mad or drunk, the Abbé Sieyès said, to speak well in the known languages. One must be drunk or mad, I should add, to dare, still, to use words, any word. The fanatic of elliptical gloom is sure to excel in any career save that of being a writer. Having always lived in fear of being surprised by the worst, I have tried in every circumstance to get a head start, flinging myself into misfortune long before it occurred. We do not envy those who have the capacity to pray whereas we are filled with envy of the possessors of goods, of those who know wealth and fame. Strange that we resign ourselves to someone's salvation and not to what fugitive advantages he may enjoy. I never met one interesting mind that was not richly endowed with inadmissible deficiencies. No true art without a strong dose of banality. The constant employment of the unaccustomed readily wearies us, nothing being more unendurable than the uniformity of the exceptional. The trouble with using a borrowed language is that you have no right to make too many mistakes in it. Now, it is by seeking a certain incorrectness, without, however, abusing it. It is by continually approaching solecism that writing may be given the appearance of life. Each of us believes, quite unconsciously of course, that he alone pursues the truth, which the rest are incapable of seeking out and unworthy of attaining. This madness is so deep-rooted and so useful that it is impossible to realize what would become of each of us if it was someday to disappear. The first thinker was, without a doubt, the first man obsessed by why, an unaccustomed mania, not at all contagious. Rare indeed are those who suffer from it, who are a prey to questioning, and who can accept no given because they were born in consternation. To be objective is to treat others as you treat an object, a corpse, to behave with them like an undertaker. This very second has vanished forever, lost in the anonymous mass of the irrevocable. It will never return. I suffer from this, and I do not. Everything is unique and insignificant. Emily Bronte, everything that comes from her has the capacity to overwhelm me. Haworth is my Mecca. To walk along a stream, to pass, to flow with the water, without effort, without haste, while death continues in us its ruminations, its uninterrupted soliloquy. Only God has the privilege of abandoning us. Men can only drop us. Without the faculty of forgetting, our past would weigh so heavily on our present that we should not have the strength to confront another moment, still less to live through it. Life would be bearable only to frivolous natures, those in fact who do not remember. Plotinus, Porphyry tells us, had the gift of reading men's souls. One day, without any warning, he told his astounded disciple not to try killing himself, but rather to take a journey. Porphyry left for Sicily. There he was cured of his melancholy, but, he adds regretfully, he thereby missed being present at his master's death, which occurred during his absence. It has been a long time since philosophers have read men's souls. It is not their task, we are told. Perhaps. But we must not be surprised if they no longer matter much to us. A work exists only if it is elaborated in the darkness with attention, with all the care of the murderer plotting his crime. In both cases, what counts is the will to strike. Self-knowledge, the bitterest knowledge of all, and also the kind we cultivate least. What is the use of catching ourselves out, morning to night, in the act of illusion, pitilessly tracing each act back to its root, and losing case after case before our own tribunal? Each time I have a lapse of memory, I think of the anguish which must afflict those who know they no longer remember anything. But something tells me that after a certain time, a secret joy possesses them, a joy they would not agree to trade for any of their memories, even the most stirring. To claim you are more detached, more alien to everything than anyone, and to be merely a fanatic of indifference. The more you are a victim of contradictory impulses, the less you know which to yield to. To lack character, precisely that, and nothing but. Pure time, time decanted, freed of events, beings, and things, appears only at certain moments of the night, when you feel it coming on, with the one intention of sweeping you off toward an exemplary catastrophe. 3. Suddenly feeling that you know as much as God about anything and everything, and quite as suddenly seeing the sensation vanish. First-hand thinkers meditate upon things, the others upon problems. We must live face to face with being and not with the mind. What are you waiting for in order to give up? Each sickness sends us a summons disguised as a question. We play deaf even as we realize that the game is played out, and that next time we must have the courage at last to capitulate. The older I grow, the less I react to frenzy, delirium. My taste among thinkers now goes only to extinct volcanoes. As a young man, I bored myself to death, but I believed in myself. If I had no suspicion of the dreary creature I was to become, I knew nonetheless that, whatever happened, perplexity would not desert me, that it would keep watch over my years with all the zeal and exactitude of Providence. If we could see ourselves as others see us, we would vanish on the spot. I once remarked to an Italian friend that the Latin peoples are without secrecy, too open, too garrulous, and that I preferred nations ravaged by timidity, adding that a writer who has failed to know it in his life is worthless in his writings. "You're right," he answered. "When we describe our experiences in our books, there is a lack of intensity and of extension, for we have already told them 100 times before." Whereupon we talked about the literature of femininity, of its absence of mystery in countries where the salon and the confessional prevail. We should never deprive ourselves, I forgot who once remarked, of the pleasures of piety. Has religion ever been justified more delicately? This craving to revise our enthusiasms, to change idols, to pray elsewhere, to stretch out in a field, to smell the earth and tell yourself it is the end, as well as the hope of our dejections, that it would be futile to search for anything better to rest on, to dissolve into. When I happen to be busy, I never give a moment's thought to the meaning of anything, particularly of whatever it is I am not doing. A proof that the secret of everything is in action and not in abstention, that fatal cause of consciousness. What will be the physiognomy of painting, of poetry, of music in 100 years? No one can tell. As after the fall of Athens, of Rome, a long pause will intervene, caused by the exhaustion of the means of expression, as well as by the exhaustion of consciousness itself. Humanity, to rejoin the past, must invent a second naivete, without which the arts can never begin again. In one of the chapels of this ideally ugly church, we find the Virgin standing with her Son above the globe, an aggressive sect which has undermined and conquered an empire and inherited its flaws, beginning with gigantism. It is written in the Zohar, "When man appeared, thereupon appeared the flowers." I suspect they were there long before him, and that his advent plunged them all into a stupefaction from which they have not yet recovered. Impossible to read a line by Kleist without thinking that he committed suicide, as if his suicide had preceded his works. In the Orient, the oddest, the most idiosyncratic Western thinkers would never have been taken seriously on account of their contradictions. This is precisely why we are interested in them. We prefer not a mind, but the reversals, the biography of a mind, the incompatibilities and aberrations to be found there. In short, those thinkers who, unable to conform to the rest of humanity, and still less to themselves, cheat as much by whim as by fatality. Their distinctive sign? A touch of fakery in the tragic, a hint of dalliance even in the irremediable. If, in her Foundations, Teresa of Avila lingers over the subject of melancholia, it is because she recognizes it as incurable. Physicians, she says, cannot deal with it, and the Mother Superior of a convent, faced with such sufferers, has but one recourse: to inspire them with the dread of authority, to threaten them, to frighten them. The saint's method remains the best. Only kicks, slaps, and a good beating will be effective in the case of a depressive. Moreover, such treatment is precisely what the depressive himself resorts to when he decides to end it all. He merely employs more thorough means. In relation to any act of life, the mind acts as a killjoy. Easy to imagine the elements, bored with their exhausted theme, disgusted by their invariable and utterly predictable combinations, seeking some diversion. Life would be merely a digression, merely an anecdote. Anything that can be done seems to me pernicious and at best futile. If need be, I can rouse myself, but not act. I understand all too well Wordsworth's description of Coleridge: eternal activity without action. Whenever something still seems possible, I have the sense I have been bewitched. The one sincere confession is the one we make indirectly when we talk about other people. We do not adopt a belief because it is true, they are all true, but because some obscure power impels us to do so. When this power leaves us, we suffer prostration and collapse, a tete-a-tete with what is left of ourselves. The quality of every perfect form is to release the mind immediately, whereas the corrupt form holds the mind prisoner, like a bad mirror which tells us of nothing but itself. In Kleist's praise, and how un-German it sounds, of limpidity, his target was not philosophy in particular, yet his is the best possible critique of philosophical jargon, a pseudo-language which, attempting to reflect ideas, merely assumes a contour at their expense, merely denatures and darkens them, merely calls attention to itself. By one of the most troublesome of all usurpations, the word has taken the leading role, in a realm where it should be imperceptible. O Satan, my master, I give myself unto thee forever. How I regret not remembering the name of the nun who, having written these words with a nail dipped in her own blood, deserves to figure in an anthology of prayer and concision. Consciousness is much more than the thorn. It is the dagger in the flesh. Ferocity occurs in all conditions save in joy. Schadenfreude, malicious joy, is a misrepresentation. To do evil is a pleasure, not a joy. Joy, the one true victory over the world, is pure in its essence, hence irreducible to pleasure, which is always suspect, both in itself and in its manifestations. An existence constantly transfigured by failure. The wise man consents to everything, for he identifies himself with nothing, an opportunist without desires. Nature's great mistake was to have been unable to confine herself to one kingdom. Juxtaposed with the vegetable, everything else seems inopportune, out of place. The sun should have sulked at the appearance of the first insect and gone out altogether with the advent of the chimpanzee. If, as we grow older, we scrutinize our own past at the expense of problems, it is simply because we handle memories more readily than ideas. The last whose disloyalty we forgive are those we have disappointed. What other people do, we always feel we could do better. Unfortunately, we do not have the same feeling about we ourselves do. I was the prophet, Muhammad informs us, when Adam was still between the water and the clay. When we have not had the pride to found a religion, or at least to destroy one, how do we dare show ourselves in the light of day? Detachment cannot be learned. It is inscribed in a civilization. We do not tend toward it. We discover it in ourselves. I was thinking this when I read that a missionary, after 18 years in Japan, had made only 60 converts, and old ones at that. Moreover, they escaped him at the last moment, dying in Japanese fashion, without remorse, without torments, worthy descendants of their ancestors who, to inure themselves, in the days of the Mongol wars, let themselves be impregnated by the nothingness of all things, and by their own nothingness. We can meditate upon eternity only in a prone position. For a considerable period, eternity was the Orientals' principal concern. Did they not prefer the horizontal position? Once we lie down, time ceases to pass, to count. History is the product of a race that stands. As a vertical animal, man was to get into the habit of looking ahead, not only in space, but in time as well. To which wretched origins we may trace the future. Every misanthrope, however sincere, at times reminds me of that old poet, bedridden and utterly forgotten, who in a rage with his contemporaries declared he would receive none of them. His wife, out of charity, would ring at the door from time to time. A work is finished when we can no longer improve it, though we know it to be inadequate and incomplete. We are so overtaxed by it that we no longer have the power to add a single comma, however indispensable. What determines the degree to which a work is done is not a requirement of art or of truth. It is exhaustion, and, even more, disgust. Whereas any sentence one has to write requires a pretense of invention, it takes little enough attention to enter into a text, even a difficult one. To scribble a postcard comes closer to creative activity than to read the phenomenology of mind. Buddhism calls anger corruption of the mind. Manichaeism, root of the tree of death. I know this. But what good does it do me to know? She meant absolutely nothing to me. Realizing, suddenly, after so many years, that whatever happens I shall never see her again, I nearly collapsed. We understand what death is only by suddenly remembering the face of someone who has been a matter of indifference to us. As art sinks into paralysis, artists multiply. This anomaly ceases to be one if we realize that art, on its way to exhaustion, has become both impossible and easy. No one is responsible for what he is, nor even for what he does. This is obvious, and everyone more or less agrees that it is so. Then why celebrate or denigrate? Because to exist is to evaluate, to emit judgment, and because abstention, when it is not the effect of apathy or cowardice, requires an effort no one manages to make. Every form of haste, even toward the good, betrays some mental disorder. The least impure thoughts are those which appear between our anxieties, in the intervals of our annoyance, in those deluxe moments our misery grants itself. Imaginary pains are by far the most real we suffer, since we feel a constant need for them and invent them, because there is no way of doing without them. If it is characteristic of the wise man to do nothing useless, no one will surpass me in wisdom. I do not even lower myself to useful things. Impossible to imagine a degraded animal, a sub-animal. Oh, to have been born before man. Try as I will, I cannot manage to scorn all those centuries during which men busied themselves with nothing more than perfecting a definition of God. The most effective way to avoid dejection, motivated or gratuitous, is to take a dictionary, preferably of a language you scarcely know, and to look up word after word in it, making sure that they are the kind you will never use. As long as you live on this side of the terrible, you will find no words to express it. Once you know it from inside, you will no longer find a single one. There is no limit disappointment. Grievances of every kind pass, but their source abides, and nothing has any effect on it, unassailable and unvarying. It is our fatum. To realize, in rage and desolation alike, that nature, as Bossuet says, will not long grant us this morsel of matter she lends, this morsel of matter. By dint of pondering it, we reach peace, though a peace it would be better never to have known. Paradox is not suited to burials, nor to weddings or births, in fact. Sinister, or grotesque, events require commonplaces. The terrible, like the painful, accommodates only the cliché. However disabused one may be, it is impossible to live without any hope at all. We always keep one, unwittingly, and this unconscious hope makes up for all the explicit others we have rejected, exhausted. The more laden he is with years, the more readily he speaks of his death as a distant, quite unlikely event. Life is now such a habit that he has become unfit for death. A blind man, authentically blind for once, held out his hand. In his posture, his rigidity, there was something that caught you, that made you hold your breath. He was handing you his blindness. We forgive only madmen and children for being frank with us. Others, if they have the audacity to imitate them, will regret it sooner or later. To be happy, you must constantly bear in mind the miseries you have escaped. This would be a way for memory to redeem itself, since ordinarily it preserves only disasters, eager, and with what success, to sabotage happiness. After a sleepless night, the people in the street seem automatons. No one seems to breathe, to walk. Each looks as if he is worked by clockwork. Nothing spontaneous, mechanical smiles, spectral gesticulations. Yourself a spectre, how would you see others as alive? To be sterile, with so many sensations. Perpetual poetry without words. Pure fatigue. Fatigue without cause, the kind that comes like a gift or a scourge. That is what helps me pull myself together. That is what affords me knowledge of myself. Once it leaves me, I am no more than an inanimate object. Anything in folklore that remains alive comes from before Christianity. The same is true of whatever is alive in each of us. A man who fears ridicule will never go far, for good or ill. He remains on this side of his talents, and even if he has genius, he is doomed to mediocrity. Amid your most intense activities, pause a moment to consider your mind. This advice is surely not offered to those who consider their minds night and day, and who thereby have no need to suspend their activities, for the good reason that they engage in none. Only what has been conceived in solitude, face to face with God, endures, whether one is a believer or not. A passion for music is in itself an avowal. We know more about a stranger who yields himself up to it than about someone who is deaf to music, and whom we see every day. No meditation without a tendency to repetitiveness. As long as God had him in tow, man advanced slowly, so slowly he did not even realize it. Now that he no longer lives in anyone's shadow, he is in a rush, and deplores it. He would give anything to regain the old cadence. We have lost, being born, as much as we shall lose, dying. Everything. Satiety. I have just now uttered this word, and already I no longer know apropos of what. So readily does it apply to everything I feel and think, to everything I love and loathe, to satiety itself. I have killed no one. I have done better. I have killed the possible, and like Macbeth, what I need most is to pray. But like him too, I cannot say, Amen. 4. To deliver blows, none of which land, to attack everyone without anyone's noticing, to shoot arrows whose poison you alone receive. X, whom I have always treated as badly as I could, does not resent me because he resents no one. He forgives every insult. He even forgets them. How I envy him. To be like him, I should have to live through several existences and exhaust all my possibilities of transmigration. In the days when I set off on month-long bicycle trips across France, my greatest pleasure was to stop in country cemeteries, to stretch out between two graves, and to smoke for hours on end. I think of those days as the most active period of my life. How can you control yourself, master your behavior, when you come from a country where people howl at funerals? On certain mornings, no sooner have I stepped out the door than I hear voices calling my name. Am I really me? Is it really my name? It is. It fills all space. It is on the lips of every passerby. Each pronounces it, even that woman in the next telephone booth at the post office. Sleepless nights devour the last vestiges of our common sense, our modesty, and would rob us of our reason if the fear of ridicule didn't come to save us. My curiosity and my repulsion, as well as my terror under his oily metallic gaze, his obsequiousness, his unvarnished cunning, his strangely unveiled hypocrisy, his continual and obvious dissimulations, that mixture of scoundrel and madman, His insincerity is evident in each gesture, in every word. Insincerity isn't the right word, for to be insincere is to conceal the truth, and to know the truth. But in him there is no trace, no notion, no atom of truth, nor of lying either, nothing but a loathsome covetousness, a calculating lunacy. Around midnight, a woman in tears comes up to me in the street. They've knifed my husband. France is disgusting. Luckily I'm from Brittany. They took away my children. They kept me on drugs for 6 months. Not having realized at first that she was mad, so real her agony seemed, and in a sense was, I let her chatter on for a good half hour. Talking did her good. Then I abandoned her, telling myself that the difference between us would be infinitesimal if I began to pour out my recriminations to the first comer. A professor in an Eastern European country tells me that his mother, a peasant woman, was astonished to find out he was suffering from insomnia. When sleep didn't come, all she had to do was imagine a huge wheat field swaying in the wind, and she fell asleep at once. With the image of a city, one would not arrive at the same result. It is inexplicable and miraculous that any city dweller ever manages to close an eye. The little tavern is frequented by the old men who live in the home at the end of the village. They come here, sitting with a glass in one hand, staring at each other without a word. One of them begins telling something he thinks is funny. No one listens. In any case, no one laughs. All of them have drudged for years to get here. In the old days, in the countryside, someone would have smothered them under a pillow. A wise recipe, perfected by each family, and incomparably more humane than this one, gathering them together, sitting them here, and curing them of boredom by stupor. According to the Bible, it is Cain who created the first city, in order to have, as Bossuet puts it, a place wherein to elude his remorse. What a judgment! And how many times have I not felt its accuracy in my night walks through Paris? One night, climbing the stairs in the dark, I was halted by an invincible force rising from both within and without. Unable to take another step, I stood there nailed to the spot, petrified. Impossibility. This ordinary word came, more apropos than usual, to enlighten me as to myself, no less than as to the word as well. It had so often come to my aid, yet never as now. At last I understood, definitively, what it meant. An ancient cleaning woman, in answer to my "How's everything going?" answers without looking up, "Taking its course." This ultra-banal answer nearly brings me to tears. The more such turns of speech, which deal with becoming, with the passage of time, with the course of things, are worn down, the more likely they are to acquire the quality of a revelation. But the truth is not that they create an exceptional state, only that you yourself were in that state without realizing it, and that it required only a sign or a pretext for the extraordinary to occur. We lived in the country. I went to school, and, an important detail, I slept in my parents' room. At night it was my father's habit to read aloud to my mother. Though he was a Greek Orthodox priest, he would read anything, doubtless assuming that at my age I wouldn't understand. Usually I didn't even listen and fell asleep, unless the text was some gripping story. One night I pricked up my ears. He was reading the scene from a biography of Rasputin, where the father, on his deathbed, calls his son to him and says, "Go to St. Petersburg and make yourself master of the city. Fear nothing and no one, for God is an old hog." Such an enormity in my father's mouth, for whom the priesthood was not a joke, impressed me as much as a conflagration or an earthquake. But I also distinctly recall, this was over 50 years ago, that my emotion was followed by a strange, dare I say, perverse pleasure. Having penetrated, in the course of years, quite deeply into 2 or 3 religions, I have always retreated on the threshold of conversion, lest I lie to myself. None of them was, in my eyes, free enough to admit that vengeance is a need, the most intense and profound of all, and that each man must satisfy it, if only in words. If we stifle that need, we expose ourselves to serious disturbances. More than one disorder, perhaps all disorders, derive from a vengeance too long postponed. We must learn how to explode. Any disease is healthier than the one provoked by a hoarded rage. Philosophy in the morgue. My nephew was obviously a failure. If he had succeeded in making something of himself, he would have had a different ending than this. You know, madame, I replied to the monumental matron who had addressed me, whether one succeeds or not comes down to the same thing. You're right, she said, after a few seconds' thought. This unexpected acquiescence on the part of such a woman moved me almost as much as the death of my friend. Misfits. It seems to me that their adventure, more than any other, sheds a light on the future, that they alone allow us to glimpse and to decipher it, and that if we set their exploits aside, we utterly disqualify ourselves from describing the days to come. A pity, you were saying, that N has never produced anything. So what? He exists. If he had given birth to books, if he had had the misfortune to realize himself, we wouldn't have been talking about him the last hour. The advantage of being someone is rarer than that of creating. To produce is easy. What is difficult is to scorn the use of one's gifts. Filming a scene, there are countless takes of the same incident. Someone watching in the street, obviously a provincial, can't get over it. After this, I'll never go to the movies again. One might react similarly with regard to anything whose underside one has seen, whose secret one has seized. Yet, by an obnubilation which has something of the miraculous about it, there are gynecologists who are attracted to their patients, grave-diggers who father children, incurables who lay plans, skeptics who write. T, a rabbi's son, complains that this age of unprecedented persecutions has seen the birth of no original prayer capable of being adopted by the community and uttered in the synagogues. I assure him that he is mistaken to be distressed or alarmed by the fact. The great disasters yield nothing on the literary or religious level. Only the semi-misfortunes are fruitful, because they can be, because they are a point of departure, whereas too perfect a hell is almost as sterile as paradise. I was 20. Everything was a burden. One day I collapsed on a couch with an "I can't take it any longer." My mother, already driven distracted by my sleepless nights, told me she had just had a mass said for my rest. Not one, but 30,000. I would have liked to shout at her, thinking of the figure Charles V inscribed in his will, for a much longer rest. True enough. I ran across him again, quite by chance, after 25 years. Unchanged, intact, fresher than ever, he actually seems to have retreated toward adolescence. Where has he been hiding, and what has he done to escape the action of the years, to avoid our wrinkles and grimaces? And how has he lived, if in fact he has lived at all? Actually, a ghost. He must have cheated. He has not performed his duty as a living man, not played the game. A ghost, yes. And a gate-crasher. I discern no sign of destruction on his countenance, none of those marks which testify that one is a real being, an individual and not an apparition. What can I say to him? I feel awkward, embarrassed, even afraid. So greatly are we upset by anyone who escapes time or merely deceives it. D.C., who was writing his recollections of childhood in his Romanian village, having told his neighbor, a peasant named Coman, that he wouldn't be left out, received a visit from the latter early the next day. I know I'm a worthless man, but all the same I didn't think I'd fallen so low as to be talked about in a book. How superior the oral world was to ours. Beings, I should say peoples, live in the truth only as long as they have a horror of the written. Once they catch the virus, they enter the inauthentic. They lose their old superstitions to acquire a new one, worse than all the others combined. Incapable of getting up, nailed to my bed, I drift with the whims of my memory, and I see myself wandering, as a child, in the Carpathians. One day I stumbled on a dog whose master, doubtless to be rid of it, had tied it to a tree. The animal was little more than a skeleton, so drained of life that it barely had the strength to look at me, without being able to move. Yet it was standing, that dog. A stranger comes and tells me he has killed someone. He is not wanted by the police because no one suspects him. I am the only one who knows he is the killer. What am I to do? I lack the courage as well as the treachery, for he has entrusted me with a secret, and what a secret, to turn him in. I feel I am his accomplice, and resign myself to being arrested and punished as such. At the same time, I tell myself this would be too ridiculous. Perhaps I shall go and denounce him all the same, and so on, until I wake up. The interminable is the speciality of the indecisive. They cannot mark life out for their own, and still less their dreams, in which they perpetuate their hesitations, pusillanimities, scruples. They are ideally qualified for nightmare. A film about wild animals, endless cruelty in every latitude. Nature, the torturer of genius, steeped in herself and her work, exults with good reason. There is not a moment when what is alive fails to tremble, to make others tremble. Pity is a strange luxury only the most perfidious and the fiercest creature could invent out of a need to punish and torture itself, out of ferocity still. On a poster which, at a church door, announces the art of the fugue, someone has scrawled in huge letters, "God is dead." This apropos of the composer who testifies that God, in the event of his decease, can revive precisely while we are listening to certain cantatas, certain fugues. We have spent a little over an hour together. He has used the time to show off, and by dint of trying to say interesting things about himself, has succeeded. If he had merely swaggered in moderation, I should have found him a bore and left in a few minutes. By exaggerating, by playing the peacock to perfection, he has come close enough to wit to show some. The desire to appear subtle does not destroy subtlety. A mental defective, if he could feel the longing to astonish, would manage to deceive us, would even catch up with intelligence. X, who is older than the patriarchs, after inveighing, during a long tete-a-tete, against this one and that, tells me, "The great weakness of my life is that I've never hated anyone." Our hatred does not diminish with the years. In fact, it mounts. That of an old man like X attains incredible proportions. Now insensitive to his former affections, he puts all his faculties at the service of his rancors, which, miraculously reinvigorated, will survive the crumbling of his memory and even of his reason. The danger of frequenting the old is that when we find them so far from detachment and so incapable of espousing it, we arrogate to ourselves all the advantages they are supposed to have and do not, and it is inevitable that our real or imaginary advance upon them in matters of weariness or disgust should incite to presumption. Every family has its own philosophy. One of my cousins, who died young, once wrote me, "It's all the way it's always been, and probably always will be until there's nothing left anymore." Whereas my mother ended the last note she ever sent me with this testamentary sentence: "Whatever people try to do, they'll regret it sooner or later." Nor can I even boast of having acquired this vice of regret by my own setbacks. It precedes me. It participates in the patrimony of my tribe. What a legacy. Such unfitness for illusion. A few kilometers from the village where I was born, there was a hamlet perched on a hill and inhabited solely by gypsies. In 1910, an amateur ethnologist visited the place, accompanied by a photographer. He managed to collect the inhabitants, who agreed to let their picture be taken, without knowing what that meant. At the instant they were asked to hold still, an old woman shrieked, "Watch out, they're stealing our souls," whereupon they all flung themselves upon the two visitors, who had the greatest difficulty making their escape. These half-savage gypsies, what were they but India, their land of origin, which, under these circumstances, was speaking through them? In continual rebellion against my ancestry, I have spent my whole life wanting to be something else. Spanish, Russian, cannibal, anything, except what I was. It is an aberration to want to be different from what you are, to espouse in theory any and every condition except your own. The day I read the list of nearly all the Sanskrit words that designate the Absolute, I realized that I had taken the wrong path, the wrong country, the wrong idiom. A friend, after I don't know how many years of silence, writes that she hasn't much longer to live, and that she is preparing to enter the unknown. The cliché gives me a start. I find it hard to see what one might enter by death. Any affirmation in this realm seems to me a delusion. Death is not a state, perhaps not even a transition. Then what is it? And by what cliché, in my turn, will I answer my friend? I may change my opinion on the same subject, the same event, 10, 20, 30 times in the course of a single day, and to think that each time, like the worst impostor, I dare utter the word truth. Hale and hearty still, the woman dragged her husband after her, a tall, hunched man, eyes staring. She dragged him as if he had been the survivor of another age, an apoplectic and suppliant diplodocus. An hour later, a second encounter. A neatly dressed old woman, extremely stooped, advanced toward me, her body forming a perfect half circle. She necessarily kept her eyes on the ground, doubtless counting her unimaginable, slow, tiny footsteps. It was as if she were learning how to walk, as if she were afraid of not knowing how and where to place her feet in order to move. Everything is good, which brings me closer to Buddha. Despite her white hair, she still paraded up and down her part of the sidewalk, looking for customers. I would run into her often, at 3 a.m, and never felt like going home until I had heard her tell a few anecdotes or exploits. I have forgotten anecdotes and exploits alike, but not the readiness with which, one night, when I had begun storming against all the sleeping vermin of Paris, she broke in with her forefinger pointing to heaven and, "What about the vermin up there?" Everything is without basis, without substance, and I never repeat it to myself without feeling something like happiness. Unfortunately, there are so many moments when I fail to repeat it to myself. 5. I read for him the shipwrecked feeling I get from anything he writes. At first you follow, then you start going in circles, then you are caught up in a kind of mild, unmenacing whirlpool, and you tell yourself you're sinking, and then you do sink. But you don't really drown. That would be too easy. You come back up to the surface, you follow all over again, amazed to see he seems to be saying something and to understand what it is. And then you start going round and round again, and you sink once more. All of which is meant to be profound, and seems so. But once you come to your senses, you realize it's only abstruse, obscure, and that the distance between real profundity and the willed kind is as great as between a revelation and a whim. Anyone who gives himself up to writing believes, without realizing the fact, that his work will survive the years, the ages, time itself. If he felt, while he was at work on it, that it was perishable, he would leave off where he was. He could never finish. Activity and credulity are correlative terms. Laughter ceased, and after laughter, smiles. This apparently naive remark by a biographer of Alexander Bloch defines to perfection the program of any and every downfall. No easy matter to speak of God when one is neither a believer nor an atheist, and it is undoubtedly the drama we all share, theologians included, no longer capable of being either one or the other. For a writer, progress toward detachment and deliverance is an unprecedented disaster. He, more than anyone else, needs his defects. If he triumphs over them, he is lost. He must be careful, then, not to improve, for if he succeeds, he will regret it bitterly. We must beware of whatever insights we have into ourselves. Our self-knowledge annoys and paralyzes our daemon. This is where we should look, for the reasons Socrates wrote nothing. What makes bad poets worse is that they read only poets, just as bad philosophers read only philosophers, whereas they would benefit much more from a book of botany or geology. We are enriched only by frequenting disciplines remote from our own. This is true, of course, only for realms where the ego is rampant. Tertullian tells us that in order to be cured, epileptics would go and greedily suck the blood of criminals slaughtered in the arena. If I were to heed my instinct, this would be the one type of medication, no matter what the disease, which I would adopt. What right have we to be annoyed by someone who calls us a monster? The monster is unique by definition, and solitude, even the solitude of infamy, supposes something positive, a peculiar election, but undeniably an election. Two enemies, the same man divided. Never judge a man without putting yourself in his place. This old proverb makes all judgment impossible, for we judge someone only because, in fact, we cannot put ourselves in his place. If you love your independence, you must lend yourself, in order to protect it, to every turpitude. You must risk ignominy itself. Nothing more abominable than the critic and, a fortiori, the philosopher in each of us. If I were a poet, I should behave like Dylan Thomas, who, when people would discuss his poems in his presence, would drop to the floor in a fit of convulsions. Anyone who bestirs himself commits one injustice after the next, without a trace of remorse, just bad humor. Remorse is for those who do nothing, who cannot act. It replaces action for them, consoles them for their ineffectuality. Most of our troubles come from our first impulses. The slightest enthusiasm costs more than a crime. Since we remember clearly only our ordeals, it is ultimately the sick, the persecuted, the victims in every realm who will have lived to the best advantage. The others, the lucky ones, have a life, of course, but not the memory of a life. What a bore, someone who doesn't deign to make an impression. Vain people are almost always annoying, but they make an effort, they take the trouble. They are bores who don't want to be bores, and we are grateful to them for that. We end by enduring them, even by seeking them out. On the other hand, we turn livid with fury in the presence of someone who pays no attention whatever to the effect he makes. What are we to say to him, and what are we to expect from him? Either keep some vestiges of the monkey, or else stay at home. Not the fear of effort, but the fear of success explains more than one failure. I'd like to pray with dagger words. Unfortunately, if you pray at all, you have to pray like everyone else, wherein abides one of the greatest difficulties of faith. We dread the future only when we are not sure we can kill ourselves when we want to. Neither Bossuet, nor Malebranche, nor Fénelon deigned to mention the pensée. Apparently, Pascal didn't strike them as sufficiently serious. Fear is the antidote to boredom. The remedy must be stronger than the disease. If only I could reach the level of the man I would have liked to be. But some power, increasing year by year, draws me down. Even to get back up to my surface, I have to employ stratagems I cannot think of without blushing. There was a time when, in order to dispel any impulse of vengeance, once I had endured some affront, I would imagine myself quite still in my grave, and I calmed down at once. We must not despise our corpse too much. It can be useful, on occasion. Every thought derives from a thwarted sensation. The only way to reach another person at any depth is to move toward what is deepest in yourself. In other words, to take the opposite path from the one followed by so-called generous minds. If only I could say, with that Hasidic rabbi, the blessing of my life is that I have never needed a thing before I possessed it. In permitting man, nature has committed much more than a mistake in her calculations, a crime against herself. Fear creates consciousness, not natural fear, but morbid fear. Otherwise, animals would have achieved a level of consciousness higher than ours. As orangutan, in the strict sense of the word, man is old. As historical orangutan, he is comparatively recent, a parvenu who has not had time to learn how to behave in life. After certain experiences, we should change names, since we ourselves are no longer the same. Everything assumes another aspect, starting with death, which seems close and desirable. We are reconciled to it, and we reach the point of calling it man's best friend, as Mozart does in a letter to his dying father. We must suffer to the end, to the moment when we stop believing in suffering. Truth remains hidden to the man filled with desire and hatred, Buddha, which is to say, to every man alive. Won over by solitude, yet he remains in the world, a stylite without a pillar. You are wrong to count on me. Who can speak in such terms? God and the failure. Everything we achieve, everything that comes out of us, aspires to forget its origins and succeeds only by opposing us. Hence the negative sign that marks all our successes. There is nothing to say about anything, so there can be no limit to the number of books. Failure, even repeated, always seems fresh, whereas success, multiplied, loses all interest, all attraction. It is not misfortune, but happiness, insolent happiness, it is true, which leads to rancor and sarcasm. An enemy is as useful as a Buddha. Exactly. For our enemy watches over us, keeps us from letting ourselves go. By indicating, by divulging our least weakness, he leads us straight to our salvation, moves heaven and earth to keep us from being unworthy of his image of us. Hence, our gratitude to him should be boundless. We get a better hold of ourselves and of being when we have reacted against, negating, dissolving books, against their noxious power, fortifying books, actually, since they provoke the very energy which denies them. The more poison they contain, the more salutary their effect, provided we read them against the grain, as we should read any book, starting with the Catechism. The greatest favor we can do an author is to forbid him to work during a certain period. Short-term tyrannies are necessary, prohibitions which would suspend all intellectual activity. Uninterrupted freedom of expression exposes talent to a deadly danger, forces it beyond its means, and keeps it from stockpiling sensations and experiences. Unlimited freedom is a crime against the mind. Self-pity is not so sterile as we suppose. Once we feel its mere onset, we assume a thinker's attitude, and come to think of it, we come to think. The Stoics' maxim, according to which we should submit uncomplainingly to things which do not depend on ourselves, takes into account only external misfortunes, which escape our will, but how to accommodate ourselves to those which come from ourselves. If we are the source of our ills, whom are we to confront? Ourselves? We manage, luckily, to forget that we are the guilty parties. And moreover, existence is tolerable only if we daily renew this lie, this act of oblivion. All my life, I have lived with the feeling that I have been kept from my true place. If the expression metaphysical exile had no meaning, my existence alone would afford it one. The more gifted a man is, the less progress he makes on the spiritual level. Talent is an obstacle to the inner life. To save the word grandeur from officialdom, we should use it only apropos of insomnia or heresy. In classical India, the sage and the saint were combined in one and the same person. To have any notion of such a success, we must imagine, if we can, a fusion between resignation and ecstasy, between a cold stoic and a disheveled mystic. Being is suspect. Then what is to be said of life, which is its deviation and stigma? When someone tells us of an unfavorable opinion about ourselves, instead of being distressed, we should think of all the evil we have spoken of others, and realize that it is only justice that as much should be said to ourselves. Ironically, no one is more vulnerable, more susceptible, and less likely to acknowledge his own defects than the backbiter. Merely tell him about the slightest reservation someone has made in his regard, and he will lose countenance, lose his temper, and drown in his own bile. Seen from the outside, harmony reigns in every sect, clan, and party. Seen from the inside, discord. Conflicts in a monastery are as frequent and as envenomed as in any society. Even when they desert hell, men do so only to reconstruct it elsewhere. The least conversion is experienced as an advance. Fortunately, there exist exceptions. One of my favorites is that 18th century Jewish sect, in which men went over to Christianity in order to debase themselves, and another is that South American Indian who, upon conversion, lamented that he must now become the prey of worms instead of being eaten by his children, an honor he would have enjoyed had he not abjured his tribe's beliefs. Only normal that man should no longer be interested in religion, but in religions, for only through them will he be in a position to understand the many versions of his spiritual collapse. When we recapitulate the stages of our career, It is humiliating to realize that we have not had the disasters we deserved, the ones we were entitled to expect. In some men, the prospect of a more or less imminent end excites energy, good or bad, and plunges them into a frenzy of activity. Artless enough to try to perpetuate themselves by their endeavor, by their work, they move heaven and earth to finish, to conclude it, not a moment to lose. The same perspective invites others to founder in what's the use, in a stagnant clear-sightedness, in the unimpeachable truths of despond. My curse on the man who, in future editions of my works, knowingly changes anything, a sentence, or only a word, a syllable, a letter, a punctuation mark. Is it the philosopher or the writer in Schopenhauer who speaks this way? Both at once, and this conjunction, when we think of the awful style of any philosophical work, is extremely rare. It is not a Hegel who would have uttered such a curse, nor any other major philosopher, except Plato. Nothing more aggravating than a seamless, unremitting irony, which leaves you no time to breathe and still less to think, which instead of being inconspicuous, occasional, is massive, automatic, at the antipodes of its essentially delicate nature. Which, in any case, is how it is used in Germany, a nation which, having meditated upon it the most, is least capable of wielding it. Anxiety is not provoked. It tries to find a justification for itself, and in order to do so seizes upon anything, the vilest pretexts, to which it clings once it has invented them. A reality which precedes its particular expressions, its varieties. Anxiety provokes itself, engenders itself. It is infinite creation, and as such is more likely to suggest the workings of the divinity than those of the psyche. Automatic melancholy, an elegiac robot. At a grave, the words game, imposture, joke, dream come to mind. Impossible to think that existence is a serious phenomenon. Certainty of faking from the start, at bottom. Over the gate of our cemetery should be written, nothing is tragic, everything is unreal. I shall not soon forget the expression of horror on what was his face, the dread, the extreme suffering, and the aggression. No, he was not happy. Never have I seen a man so uncomfortable in his coffin. Look neither ahead nor behind. Look into yourself, with neither fear nor regret. No one descends into himself so long as he remains a slave of the past or of the future. Inelegant to reproach a man for his sterility, when that is his postulate, his mode of achievement, his dream. Nights, when we have slept, are as if we had never been. The only ones that remain in our memory are the ones when we couldn't close our eyes. Night means sleepless night. In order not to have to resolve them, I have turned all my practical difficulties into theoretical ones. Faced with the insoluble, I breathe at last. To a student who wanted to know where I stood with regard to the author of Zarathustra, I replied that I had long since stopped reading him. Why? I find him too naive. I hold his enthusiasms, his fervors against him. He demolished so many idols, only to replace them with others. A false iconoclast, with adolescent aspects and a certain virginity, a certain innocence inherent in his solitary's career. He observed men only from a distance. Had he come closer, he could have neither conceived nor promulgated the Superman, that preposterous, laughable, even grotesque chimera. A crotchet which could occur only to a mind without time to age, to know the long, serene disgust of detachment. Marcus Aurelius is much closer to me. Not a moment's hesitation between the lyricism of frenzy and the prose of acceptance. I find more comfort, more hope even, in the weary emperor than in the thundering prophet. 6. Appealing that Hindu notion of entrusting our salvation to someone else, to a chosen saint, and permitting him to pray in our place, to do anything in order to save us, selling our soul to God. Does talent have any need of passions? Yes, of many passions, repressed. Joubert. Not one moralist we cannot convert into a precursor of Freud. It is always surprising to discover that the great mystics produced so much, that they left so many treatises. Undoubtedly, their intention was to celebrate God and nothing else. This is true in part, but only in part. We do not create a body of work without attaching ourselves to it, without subjugating ourselves to it. Writing is the least ascetic of all actions. When I lie awake far into the night, I am visited by my evil genius, as Brutus was by his before the Battle of Philippi. Do I look like someone who has something to do here on earth? That's what I'd like to answer the busybodies who inquire into my activities. It has been said that a metaphor must be able to be drawn. Whatever is original and lasting in literature for at least a century contradicts this remark. For if anything has outlived its usefulness, it is coherent metaphor, one with explicit contours. It is against such metaphor that poetry has unceasingly rebelled, to the point where a dead poetry is a poetry afflicted with coherence. Listening to the weather report, I feel a strong response to the words scattered rain, which certainly proves that poetry is in ourselves and not in the expression, though scattered is an adjective capable of setting up a certain vibration. Once I formulate a doubt, or more exactly, once I feel the need to formulate a doubt, I experience a curious, disturbing well-being. It would be far easier for me to live without a trace of belief than without a trace of doubt. Devastating doubt, nourishing doubt. There is no false sensation. Withdraw into yourself, perceive there is a silence as old as being, even older. If I detest man, I could not say with the same ease, I detest the human being. For in spite of everything, there is something more, something enigmatic and engaging in that word being, which suggests qualities alien to the idea of man. In the Dhammapada, it is suggested that in order to achieve deliverance, we must be rid of the double yoke of good and evil. That good itself should be one of our fetters, we are too spiritually retarded to be able to admit, and so we shall not be delivered. Everything turns on pain. The rest is accessory, even non-existent, for we remember only what hurts. Painful sensations being the only real ones, it is virtually useless to experience others. I believe, with that madman Calvin, that we are predestined to salvation or damnation in our mother's womb. We have already lived our life before being born. A free man is one who has discerned the inanity of all points of view. A liberated man is one who has drawn the consequences of such discernment. No sanctity without an inclination to scandal. This is true not only of saints. Whoever manifests himself in any way at all proves he possesses a more or less developed taste for provocation. I feel I am free, but I know I am not. I suppressed word after word from my vocabulary. When the massacre was over, only one had escaped: solitude. I awakened, euphoric. If I have been able to hold out till now, it is because each blow, which seemed intolerable at the time, was followed by a second which was worse, then a third, and so on. If I were in hell, I'd want its circles to multiply in order to count on a new ordeal, more trying than its predecessor. A salutary policy, with regards to torments at least. What music appeals to in us is difficult to know. What we do know is that music reaches a zone so deep that madness itself cannot penetrate there. We should have been excused from lugging a body. The burden of the self was enough. To recover a taste for certain things, to make my soul over, a nap of several cosmic epochs would be welcome. I could never understand that friend who, back from Lapland, told me how oppressed he felt when, for days on end, he lived without seeing the slightest trace of mankind. The flayed man as theoretician of detachment. The convulsionary as skeptic. A burial in a Norman village. I asked for details from a farmer watching the procession from a distance. He was still young, barely 60. They found him dead in the field. Well, that's how it is. That's how it is. This refrain, which struck me as comical at the time, has haunted me ever since. The fellow had no idea that what he was saying about death was all that can be said, and all we know. I like to read the way a chorus girl does, identifying myself with the author and the book. Any other attitude makes me think of dissecting corpses. Whenever a man converts to something, anything, we envy him at first, then we pity him, after which we despise him. We had nothing to say to one another, and while I was manufacturing my phrases, I felt that the earth was falling through space, and that I was falling with it at a speed that made me dizzy. Years and years to waken from that sleep in which the others lull, then years and years to escape that awakening. A task to be done, something I have undertaken out of necessity or choice. No sooner have I started in than everything seems important. Everything attracts me, except that. Think about those who haven't long to live, who know that everything is over and done with, except the time in which the thought of their end unrolls. Deal with that time. Write for gladiators. Erosion of our being by our infirmities. The resulting void is filled by the presence of consciousness. What am I saying? That void is consciousness itself. Moral disintegration when we spend time in a place that is too beautiful. The self dissolves upon contact with paradise. No doubt it was to avoid this danger that the first man made the choice he did. All things considered, there have been more affirmations than negations, at least till now. So we may deny without remorse. Beliefs will always weigh more in the scales. The substance of a work is the impossible, what we have not been able to attain, what could not be given to us, the sum of all the things which were refused us. Gogol, in hopes of a regeneration, journeys to Nazareth and discovers he is as bored there as in a Russian railroad station. This is what happens to us all when we look outside ourselves for what can exist only inside. Kill yourself because you are what you are, yes, but not because all humanity would spit in your face. Why fear the nothing in store for us, when it is no different from the nothing which preceded us? This argument of the ancients against the fear of death is unacceptable as consolation. Before, we had the luck not to exist. Now we exist, and it is this particle of existence, hence of misfortune, which dreads death. Particle is not the word, since each of us prefers himself to the universe, at any rate considers himself equal to it. When we discern the unreality of everything, we ourselves become unreal. We begin to survive ourselves, however powerful our vitality, however imperious our instincts. But they are no longer anything but false instincts and false vitality. If you are doomed to devour yourself, nothing can keep you from it. A trifle will impel you as much as a tragedy. Resign yourself to erosion at all times. Your fate wills it so. To live is to lose ground. To think that so many have succeeded in dying. Impossible not to resent those who write us overwhelming letters. In a remote province of India, everything was explained by dreams, and what is more important, dreams were used to cure diseases as well. It was according to dreams that business was conducted and matters of life and death decided, until the English came. Since then, one native said, "We no longer dream. In what we have agreed to call civilization, there resides, undeniably, a diabolic principle man has become conscious of too late, when it was no longer possible to remedy it." Lucidity without the corrective of ambition leads to stagnation. It is essential that the one sustain the other, that the one combat the other without winning, for a work, for a life to be possible. We cannot forgive those we have praised to the skies. We are impatient to break with them, to snap the most delicate chain of all, the chain of admiration, not out of insolence, but out of an aspiration to find our bearings, to be free, to be ourselves, which we manage only by an act of injustice. The problem of responsibility would have a meaning only if we had been consulted before our birth and had consented to be precisely who we are. The energy and virulence of my tedium vitae continue to astound me. So much vigor in a disease so decrepit. To this paradox I owe my present incapacity to choose my final hour. For our actions, for our vitality itself, the claim to lucidity is as ruinous as lucidity itself. Children turn, and must turn, against their parents, and the parents can do nothing about it, for they are subject to a law which decrees the relations among all the living, i.e., that each engenders his own enemy. So carefully have we been taught to cling to things that when we would be free of them, we do not know how to go about it, and if death did not come to our aid, our stubbornness in subsisting would make us find a recipe for existence beyond wearing out, beyond senility itself. Everything is wonderfully clear if we admit that birth is a disastrous, or at least an inopportune event. But if we think otherwise, we must resign ourselves to the unintelligible, or else cheat like everyone else. In a Gnostic work of the 2nd century of our era, we read, "The prayer of a melancholy man will never have the strength to rise unto God." Since man prays only in despondency, we may deduce that no prayer has ever reached its destination. He was above all others, and had had nothing to do with it. He had simply forgotten to desire. In ancient China, women suffering from anger or grief would climb onto platforms specially constructed for them in the street, and there would give free rein to their fury or their lamentations. Such confessionals should be revived and adopted the world over, if only to replace the obsolete ones of the church or the ineffectual ones of various therapeutics. This philosopher lacks keeping, or, to use the jargon, internal form. He is too fabricated to be alive or even real, a sinister puppet. What bliss to know I shall never open his books again. No one exclaims he is feeling well and that he is free, yet this is what all who know this double blessing should do. Nothing condemns us more than our incapacity to shout our good luck. To have failed in everything, always, out of a love of discouragement. The sole means of protecting your solitude is to offend everyone, beginning with those you love. A book is a postponed suicide. Say what we will, death is the best thing nature has found to please everyone. With each of us, everything vanishes, everything stops forever. What an advantage, what an abuse. Without the least effort on our part, we own the universe. We drag it into our own disappearance. No doubt about it. Dying is immoral. 7. If instead of expanding you, putting you in a state of energetic euphoria, your ordeals depress and embitter you, you can be sure you have no spiritual vocation. To live in expectation, to count on the future or on a simulacrum of the future. We are so accustomed to it that we have conceived the idea of immortality only out of a need to wait out eternity. Every friendship is an inconspicuous drama, a series of subtle wounds. Luther Dead by Lucas Furternagel, a plebeian, aggressive, terrifying mask, as of some sublime hog, which perfectly renders the features of the man we cannot sufficiently praise, for having declared, "Dreams are liars. If you shit in your bed, that's true." The more you live, the less useful it seems to have lived. At 20, those nights when for hours at a time I would stand, forehead pressed against the pane, staring into the dark. No autocrat wields a power comparable to that enjoyed by a poor devil planning to kill himself. Educating yourself not to leave traces is a moment-by-moment war against yourself, solely to prove that you could, if you chose, become a sage. To exist is a state as little conceivable as its contrary. No, still more inconceivable. In antiquity, books were so costly that one could not accumulate them unless one was a king, a tyrant, or Aristotle, the first to possess a library worthy of the name. One more incriminating item in the dossier of a philosopher already so catastrophic in so many regards. If I were to conform to my most intimate convictions, I should cease to take any action whatever, to react in any way. But I am still capable of sensations. A monster, however horrible, secretly attracts us, pursues us, haunts us. He represents, enlarged, our advantages and our miseries. He proclaims us. He is our standard-bearer. Over the centuries, man has slaved to believe, passing from dogma to dogma, illusion to illusion, and has given very little time to doubts, short intervals between his epochs of blindness. Indeed, there were not doubts, but pauses, moments of respite following the fatigue of faith, of any faith. Innocence being the perfect state, perhaps the only one, it is incomprehensible that a man enjoying it should seek to leave it. Yet history from its beginnings down to ourselves is only that, and nothing but that. I draw the curtains, and I wait. Actually, I am not waiting for anything. I am merely making myself absent, scoured, if only for a few minutes, of the impurities which dim and clog the mind. I accede to a state of consciousness from which the self is evacuated, and I am as soothed as if I were resting outside the universe. In one medieval exorcism, all the parts of the body, even the smallest, are listed, from which the demon is ordered to depart. A kind of lunatic anatomy treatise, fascinating for its hypertrophy of precision, its profusion of unexpected details. A scrupulous incantation. Leave the nails. Fanatic, but not without poetic effect. For authentic poetry has nothing in common with poetry. In all our dreams, even if they deal with the flood, there is always, if only for a fraction of a second, some minuscule incident we witnessed the day before. This regularity, which I have verified for years, is the only constant, the only law or semblance of law I have been able to discern in night's incredible chaos. The dissolving power of conversation. One realizes why both meditation and action require silence. The certainty of being only an accident has accompanied me on all occasions, propitious or injurious, and if it has saved me from the temptation to believe myself necessary, it has not, on the other hand, entirely cured me of a certain vainglory inherent in the loss of illusions. Rare to come upon a free mind, and when you do, you realize that the best of such a mind is not revealed in its works. When we write, we bear, mysteriously, chains, but in those confidences where, released from conviction and pose, as from all concern with rigor or standing, it displays its weaknesses, and where it behaves as a heretic to itself. If the foreigner is not a creator in the matter of language, it is because he wants to do as well as the natives. Whether or not he succeeds, this ambition is his downfall. I begin a letter over and over again. I get nowhere. What to say and how to say it. I don't even remember whom I was writing to. Only passion or profit find at once the right tone. Unfortunately, detachment is indifference to language, insensitivity to words. Yet it is by losing contact with words that we lose contact with human beings. Everyone has had, at a given moment, an extraordinary experience which will be, for him, because of the memory of it he preserves, the crucial obstacle to his inner metamorphosis. I know peace only when my ambitions sleep. Once they waken, anxiety repossesses me. Life is a state of ambition. The mole digging his tunnels is ambitious. Ambition is in effect everywhere, and we see its traces on the faces of the dead themselves. Going to India because of the Vedanta or Buddhism is about the same as going to France because of Jansenism. Moreover, the latter is more recent, since it vanished only 3 centuries ago. Not the slightest trace of reality anywhere, except in my sensations of unreality. Existence would be a quite impracticable enterprise if we stopped granting importance to what has none. Why does the Gita rank renunciation of the fruit of action so high? Because such renunciation is rare, impracticable, contrary to our nature, and because achieving it is destroying the man one has been, and one is, killing in oneself the entire past, the work of millennia. In a word, freeing oneself of the species, that hideous and immemorial riffraff. We should have abided by our larval condition, dispensed with evolution, remained incomplete, delighting in the elemental siesta and calmly consuming ourselves in an embryonic ecstasy. Truth abides in the individual drama. If I suffer authentically, I suffer much more than an individual. I transcend the sphere of my selfhood. I rejoin the essence of others. The only way to proceed toward the universal is to concern ourselves exclusively with what concerns ourselves. When we are fixated on doubt, we take more pleasure in lavishing speculations upon it than in practicing it. If you want to know a nation, frequent its second-order writers. They alone reflect its true nature. The others denounce or transfigure the nullity of their compatriots, and neither can nor will put themselves on the same level. They are suspect witnesses. In my youth, there would be weeks during which I never closed my eyes. I lived in the unlived world. I had the sense that time, with all its moments, had concentrated itself within me, where it culminated, where it triumphed. I moved it onward, of course. I was its promoter and bearer, its cause and substance, and it was as an agent and accomplice that I participated in its apotheosis. When sleep departs from us, the unheard of becomes everyday. Easy. We enter it without preparations, inhabit it, wallow in it. Astounding the number of hours I have wasted on the meaning of what exists, of what happens. But that what has no meaning, as all serious minds know. Hence they divert their time and their energy to more useful undertakings. My affinities with Russian Byronism, from Cioran to Stavrogen, my boredom and my passion for boredom. X, whom I do not particularly appreciate, was telling a story so stupid that I wakened with a start. Those we don't like rarely shine in our dreams. For lack of occupation, the old seem to be trying to solve something very complicated, devoting to it all the capacities they still possess. Perhaps this is why they do not commit suicide en masse, as they ought, were they even a trifle less absorbed. Love at its most impassioned does not bring two human beings so close together as calumny. Inseparable, slanderer and slandered constitute a transcendent unity, forever welded one to the other. Nothing can separate them. One inflicts harm, the other endures it. But if he endures it, it is because he is accustomed to doing so, can no longer do without it, even insists upon it. He knows that his wishes will be gratified, that he will never be forgotten, that whatever happens, he will be eternally present in the mind of his indefatigable benefactor. The monk errant, the wandering friar, so far the supreme achievement. To reach the point of no longer having anything to renounce, such must be the dream of any disabused mind. Sobbing negation, the only tolerable form of negation. Lucky Job, who was not obliged to annotate his lamentations. Late at night, I feel like falling into a frenzy, doing some unprecedented thing to release myself, but I don't see against whom, against what. Madame Daudicoeur, Saint-Simon observes, had never spoken good of anyone in her life without adding some crushing buts. A wonderful definition not of backbiting, but of conversation in general. Everything that lives makes noise. What an argument for the mineral kingdom. Bach was quarrelsome, litigious, self-serving, greedy for titles and honors, etc. So what? A musicologist listing the cantatas, whose theme is death, has remarked that no mortal ever had such a nostalgia for it, which is all that counts. The rest has to do with biography. The misfortune of being incapable of neutral states except by reflection and effort. What an idiot achieves at the outset, we must struggle night and day to attain, and only by fits and starts. I have always lived with the vision of a host of moments marching against me. Time will have been my Burnham wood. Painful or wounding questions asked by the uncouth distress and anger us, and may have the same effect as certain techniques of Oriental meditation. Who knows if a dense, aggressive stupidity might not provoke illumination? It is certainly worth as much as a rap on the head with a stick. Knowledge is not possible, and even if it were, would solve nothing. Such is the doubter's position. What does he want, then? What is he looking for? Neither he nor anyone will ever know. Skepticism is the rapture of impasse. Besieged by others, I try to make my escape, without much success, it must be confessed. Yet I manage to wangle myself, day by day, a few seconds' audience with the man I would have liked to be. By a certain age, we should change names and hide out somewhere, lost to the world, in no danger of seeing friends or enemies again, leading the peaceful life of an overworked malefactor. We cannot reflect and be modest. Once the mind is set to work, it replaces God and anything else. It is indiscretion, encroachment, profanation. It does not build, it dislocates. The tension its methods betray reveals its brutal, implacable character. Without a good dose of ferocity, we could not follow a thought to its conclusion. Most subverters, visionaries, and saviors have been either epileptics or dyspeptics. There is unanimity as to the virtues of epilepsy. Gastric upheavals are regarded, on the other hand, as less meritorious. Yet nothing is more conducive to subversion than a digestion which refuses to be forgotten. My mission is to suffer for all those who suffer without knowing it. I must pay for them, expiate their unconsciousness, their luck to be ignorant of how unhappy they are. Each time torments me. I tell myself that one of us must back down, that it is impossible for this cruel confrontation to go on indefinitely. When we are in the depths of depression, everything which feeds it, affords it further substance, also raises it to a level where we can no longer follow, and thereby renders it too great, excessive. Scarcely surprising that we should reach the point of no longer regarding it as our own. A foretold misfortune, when at last it occurs, is 100 times harder to endure than one we did not expect. All during our apprehensions, we live through it in advance, and when it happens, these past torments are added to the present ones, and together they form a mass whose weight is intolerable. Obviously, God was a solution, and obviously none so satisfactory will ever be found again. I shall never utterly admire anyone except a man dishonored and happy. There is a man, I should say, who defies the opinion of his fellows, and who finds consolation and happiness in himself alone. The man of the Rubicon, after Pharsalus, had forgiven too many. Such magnanimity seemed offensive to those of his friends who had betrayed him, and whom he had humiliated by treating them without rancor. They felt diminished, flouted, and punished him for his clemency or for his disdain. He had refused to stoop to resentment. Had he behaved as a tyrant, they would have spared him. But they could not forgive him, since he had not deigned to frighten them enough. Everything that is engenders, sooner or later, nightmares. Let us try, therefore, to invent something better than being. Philosophy, which had made it its business to undermine beliefs when it saw Christianity spreading and on the point of prevailing, made common cause with paganism, whose superstitions seemed preferable to the triumphant insanities. By attacking and demolishing the gods, philosophy had intended to free men's minds. In reality, it handed them over to a new servitude, worse than the old one, for the god who was to replace the gods had no particular weakness for either tolerance or irony. Philosophy, it will be objected, is not responsible for the advent of this god. Indeed, this was not the god philosophy recommended. No doubt, but it should have suspected that we do not subvert the gods with impunity, that others would come to take their place, and that it had nothing to gain by the exchange. Fanaticism is the death of conversation. We do not gossip with a candidate for martyrdom. What are we to say to someone who refuses to penetrate our reasons, and who, the moment we do not bow to his, would rather die than yield? Give us dilettantes and sophists, who at least espouse all reasons. We invest ourselves with an abusive superiority when we tell someone what we think of him and of what he does. Frankness is not compatible with a delicate sentiment, nor even with an ethical exigency. More than all others, our relatives are ready to doubt our merits. It is a universal rule. Buddha himself did not escape it. One of his cousins opposed him the most, and only afterward Mara, the devil. For the victim of anxiety, there is no difference between success and fiasco. His reaction to the one is the same as to the other. Both trouble him equally. When I torment myself a little too much for not working, I tell myself that I might just as well be dead, and that then I would be working still less. Rather in a gutter than on a pedestal. The advantages of a state of eternal potentiality seem to me so considerable that when I begin listing them, I can't get over the fact that the transition to being could ever have occurred. Existence equals torment. The equation seems obvious to me, but not to one of my friends. How to convince him? I cannot lend him my sensations. Yet only they would have the power to persuade him, to give him that additional dose of ill-being he has so insistently asked for all this time. If we see things black, it is because we weigh them in the dark, because thoughts are generally the fruit of sleeplessness, consequently of darkness. They cannot adapt to life because they have not been thought with a view to life. The notion of the consequences they might involve doesn't even occur to the mind. We are beyond all human calculation, beyond any notion of salvation or perdition, of being or non-being. We are in a particular silence, a superior modality of the void. Not yet to have digested the affront of being born. To expend oneself in conversations as much as an epileptic in his fits. In order to conquer panic or some tenacious anxiety, there is nothing like imagining your own burial, an effective method readily available to all. In order not to have to resort to it too often in the course of a day, best to experience its benefits straight off when you get up, or else use it only at exceptional moments, like Pope Innocent IX, who, having commissioned a painting in which he was shown on his deathbed, glanced at it each time he had to make some important decision. There is no negator who is not famished for some catastrophic yes. We may be sure that man will never reach depths comparable to those he knew during the ages of egoistic colloquy with his God. not one moment when I am not external to the universe. No sooner have I lamented over myself, pitying my wretched condition, than I realized that the terms in which I described my misfortune were precisely those which define the first characteristic of the Supreme Being. Aristotle, Aquinas, Hegel, three enslavers of the mind. The worst form of despotism is the system, in philosophy and in everything. God is what survives the evidence that nothing deserves to be thought. When I was young, no pleasure compared with the pleasure of making enemies. Now, whenever I make one, my first thought is to be reconciled, so that I won't have to bother about him. Having enemies is a heavy responsibility. My burden is sufficient. I no longer can carry that of others as well. Joy is a light which devours itself inexhaustibly. It is the sun early on. A few days before he died, Claudel remarked that we should not call God infinite, but inexhaustible, as if it did not come down to the same thing, or just about. All the same, this concern for exactitude, this verbal scruple at the moment that he was writing that his lease on life had nearly expired, is more inspiring than a sublime word or gesture. The unusual is not a criterion. Paganini is more surprising and more unpredictable than Bach. We should repeat to ourselves every day, I am one of the billions dragging himself across the earth's surface. One and no more. This banality justifies any conclusion, any behavior or action. Debauchery, chastity, suicide, work, crime, sloth, or rebellion, whence it follows that each man is right to do what he does. Tzimtzum. This silly-sounding word designates a major concept of the Kabbalah. For the world to exist, God, who was everything and everywhere, consented to shrink, to leave a vacant space not inhabited by himself. It is in this hole that the world occurred. Thus we occupy the wasteland he conceded to us out of pity or whim. For us to exist, he contracted, he limited his sovereignty. We are the product of his voluntary reduction, of his effacement, of his partial absence. In his madness, he has actually amputated himself for us. If only he had had the good sense and the good time to remain whole. In the Gospel according to the Egyptians, Jesus proclaims, men will be the victims of death so long as women give birth. And he specifies, I am come to destroy the works of woman. When we frequent the extreme truths of the Gnostics, we should like to go, if possible, still further, to say something never said, which petrifies or pulverizes history, something out of a cosmic Neronianism, out of a madness on the scale of matter. To express an obsession is to project it outside yourself, to hunt it down, to exercise it. Obsessions are the demons of a world without faith. Man accepts death, but not the hour of his death. To die any time, except when one has to die. Once we step into a cemetery, a feeling of utter mockery does away with any metaphysical concern. Those who look for mystery everywhere do not necessarily get to the bottom of things. Most often, mystery, like the absolute, corresponds only to a mannerism of the mind. It is a word we should use only when we cannot do otherwise, in really desperate cases. If I recapitulate my plans, which have remained plans, and those which have worked out, I have every reason to regret that these latter have not suffered the fate of the former. He who is inclined to lust is merciful and tender-hearted. Those who are inclined to purity are not so. St. John Climacus. It took a saint, neither more nor less, to denounce so distinctly and so vigorously not the lies, but the very essence of Christian morality, and indeed of all morality. We are not afraid to accept the notion of an uninterrupted sleep. On the other hand, an eternal awakening, immortality, if it were conceivable, would be just that, plunges us into dread. Unconsciousness is a country, a fatherland. Consciousness, an exile. Any profound impression is voluptuous or funereal, or both at once. No one has been so convinced as I of the futility of everything, and no one has taken so tragically so many futile things. Ishi, the last American Indian of his tribe, after hiding for years in terror of the white men, reduced to starvation, surrendered of his own free will to the exterminators of his people, believing that the same treatment was in store for himself. He was made much of. He had no posterity. He was truly the last. Once humanity is destroyed or simply extinguished, we may imagine a sole survivor who would wander the earth without even having anyone to surrender to. Deep in his heart, man aspires to rejoin the condition he had before consciousness. History is merely the detour he takes to get there. Only one thing matters: learning to be the loser. Every phenomenon is a corrupt version of another, larger phenomenon. Time, a disease of eternity. History, a disease of time. Life, again, a disease of matter. Then what is normal? What is healthy? Eternity, which itself is only an infirmity of God.